Burning Point.
Hello and welcome to the show with me, Katerina Kudashkina. When it comes to discussing Ukraine, Europe needs to comply with the US demands, whereas US policymakers seem to be guided more with emotions than with plain common sense. This Monday, EU foreign ministers went to Brussels to discuss further steps after Donetsk and Lugansk had held elections on the 2nd of November and proceeded with setting up their own governing bodies, despite Western claims that the vote was illegal. The ministers agreed to put more names on the EU sanctions list, freezing the assets of those persons and imposing EU travel ban. However, they stopped short in introducing more economic sanctions. The ÉHÉSS has quoted Polish Foreign Minister Jacques as saying that the divisions on Ukrainian issue among EU states are now deeper than a month earlier when the previous such meeting took place. We are now joined by our guest speaker, Judy Dempsey, a non-resident senior associate at Carnegie Europe and editor-in-chief of Strategic Europe.
First of all, there's a consensus now, as we saw among the 28 member states, that the diplomatic track is going actually nowhere. But there still has to be worked out if they agree on what kind of further sanctions to be imposed on Russia. They can't agree on this at the moment.
Why not?
Because for two reasons. They want to see the effect of the first line of sanctions, and some of the member states want to know, is President Putin really going to try to influence what is happening in eastern Ukraine, meaning, is the ceasefire really in tatters? Mm-hmm. And when you look at all the reports coming out, you certainly get the impression that the ceasefire that was agreed in Minsk is over, and so the Europeans now have to take stock on this. There's one thing you should remember. I mean, it does take quite a long time for 28 ministers to agree on things. And when it comes to sanctions, clearly this goes back to the government leaders. The foreign ministers discuss it, but at the end of the day, you need the consensus also of the governments. So, I mean, sanctions are not easy things to just impose overnight.
Oh, yes, of course. But, however, as far as I remember, the Polish foreign minister, Jacques, so after the meeting, he said that the divergence between different EU countries has become greater over what happens in Ukraine.
I didn't see the Polish foreign minister's comments, but I was actually surprised because now the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Slovaks are coming much closer to the EU. In terms of the perception of Russia, it's terribly complicated now in Europe and in Russia. I mean, President Putin has gone into eastern Ukraine, has annexed Crimea. We're coming up to the winter, and, Crimea has huge problems with utility supplies. And, this must be a huge headache for the Kremlin and how they're going to deal with Crimea and its inhabitants and the expectations. But as for the Europeans, they have to ask themselves, are sanctions working in the long term, coupled with what's happening to the oil prices, which do seriously affect the Russian budget. And so, I mean, both sides, I can't speak for Russia, of course, but the Europeans are asking themselves, how much longer down the road can we go in imposing new sanctions? We have to know if they're going to have an effect. Mm-hmm. There's just one thing I want to add, which I found very interesting. Down at the G20 summit in Australia, really, it's quite extraordinary. You had the Canadians, of course the Americans, of course Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, you had the French, but also you had the Australians, the Japanese. I mean, there was a serious criticism of President Vladimir Putin, which is one of the reasons, I think, why he left early. It just wasn't because he needed sleep before he had to go to work on Monday. Everybody had to work on Monday again. But, I mean, this is not, a transatlantic dispute with Russia now. It seems to me that it has broadened to a much wider source of criticism of Russia's policies. And don't forget the M8, the MH17 downing of the airliner. I mean, it's just so complex now, the relations, and nobody's happy about this.
But Judy, if we talk about criticism, I suppose that Mr. Obama is also heavily criticized for handling the international policy. And Henry Kissinger, in the Der Spiegel interview, I suppose, said that the sanctions and the whole of the Ukrainian crisis has been a mistake. So do you think that both parties could rather work for some kind of a compromise?
What do you think Angela Merkel has been trying to do?
Well, but she's the only one. The U.S. has been rather reluctant to talk about the compromise.
She's the only important one. She's the one that completely understands the situation. She's been delegated to deal with President Putin. She's got the influence and the stature. So, and please, don't say that the Germans, backed by the French and the British and with Obama's backing, don't say that the Europeans haven't tried the diplomatic track. They've been trying this diplomatic track since January.
But this has been somehow coupled with rather rough wording from Mr. Obama and from NATO Secretary General.
Yeah, but what do you expect when the Russians are going into Baltic airspace all the time, encouraging on Baltic airspace? What are we meant to do? There's a whole secure post-Cold War security architecture at stake here. You know, you can turn it around the other way. What is President Putin doing to ease the tensions?
Well, there you are, Judy. So once again, we're kind of pointing fingers. But is this really an efficient way to resolve the crisis? I'm trying to explain the European position. But it'd be very, very nice to get a Russian interlocutor to say, well, you know, hasn't Angela Merkel done her best? She's spoken to Putin, as far as I can gather, Catherine, 38 times. Which means that he also tried to explain his position 38 times to Angela Merkel.
This is a very good point, but there seems to be a huge gap in the two positions. And the big task is, are we going to find, when I say we, I mean the Russians, the Europeans, Americans, and anybody else, and the OSCE, of course. You know, is there any kind of way of, first of all, stabilizing Ukraine, but in the long term, having a relationship with Russia? It's terribly crucial. I mean, Russia is our neighbor.
Yeah, precisely. Well, Judy, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
And just to remind you, our guest speaker was Judy Dempsey, a non-resident senior associate at Carnegie Europe. This is Burning Point. We're talking about emotions standing in the way of sound decision-making in Ukrainian issues. And now we're proceeding to discuss the issue with our next guest speaker, Jacques Sapir, the Director of Studies at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris.
I think that so far, political position has been overtaken largely by political emotions. And this is particularly true in France, much less, I think, in Germany or in Italy. But in France or Great Britain, I think that political emotions have overtaken a lot of rational decision-making on this issue.
So when we're getting to sanctions issue, still they have somehow stopped short of introducing more sanctions?
Well, actually, there is already a perception, you know, which is now making some progress in the European Union, is the fact that sanctions are destructive, not just for Russia, but also for the European Union. But the problem here is that it is not destructive in the European Union as a whole, but for some country of the European Union, Italy, Germany, France, and much less for other countries like Sweden, Poland, and the Baltic states. So in trying to achieve a common EU position, governments have to bargain quite easily and to achieve a kind of trade-off, you know, into interests which are not the same on this issue of the sanction. That's the first point. The second point, which is also very important, is the fact that it is not just the EU which implemented sanctions against Russia. You have also United States. And to some extent, the sanctions implemented by the United States against Russia have been much broader than the sanctions implemented by the EU. And as we know that the U.S. government could now sue any foreign company which is using the U.S. dollar in its trade with companies under the sanctions regime in Russia, this is to some extent making mandatory for the EU to adapt its own sanction regime to the American one. And to some extent, we could say now that the U.S. sanction regime is leading the way onto the EU sanction regime.
Which is definitely not in favor of the EU, correct?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. If only because United States has a very small trade with Russia when the trade between Russia and the EU is far much larger. And we could say in the last statement made by the German government that the German government is already deeply concerned by the fact that sanctions could hit very hard the German economy. The same thing is happening in Italy and to some extent also in France. Nevertheless, we still have this problem that the EU could not break away with the United States without, in the same time, contesting the decision made by the U.S. government against some European banks into this sanction regime. And, it's very important to understand the fact that the U.S. decision on some European and some French banks which were involved into deals with Iran and with Cuba, and the U.S. judicial decision which has been done this spring had a very powerful deterring effect onto EU companies and onto EU government. This is, I think, the main problem right now of the sanction regime. It's the relation between the EU and the United States. And till the moment of the EU would accept the possibility of a breakup with the United States, till this moment will come, the EU will be under the leadership of the United States on this issue. The main problem is that there is no rational approach of this issue. Of course, you have people who are making rational statements, and not just in Europe, not just in the EU. That's also happening in the United States. Henry Kissinger made some days ago. He gave an interview into the German
Der Spiegel.
newspaper,
Der Spiegel.
Mm-hmm. Well, and he explains that anti-Putinism is not a policy, is just something which is replacing a true policy toward Russia. So, you have American people which are making rational statements. You have German people making rational statements, French people, and so on. But when it comes to government are now working on one part under the weight of political emotions, and that's extremely important in Great Britain and to some extent in France, but also they are working under the threat of the U.S. government. And so far, European government have some very important problems, to overcome this kind of threat. You have also another problem. It's the fact that right now the German economic policy is contested by a lot of other countries, mostly France, Italy, Spain, but also by the United States. So, to some extent, the French and the Italian government are asking the U.S. government to put pressure onto the German government, so the German government will soften its budget and economic policy. But this is, of course, giving a very big lever to the U.S. government to push sanctions onto the French and Italian government. And, things are becoming so much in interactions that it is extremely difficult to find a position which could reunite a rational argument on the question of Ukraine and on the question of sanctions.
Mr. Sapir, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Jacques Sapir, the Director of Studies at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Well, and what happens when emotions start to prevail over a more reasonable approach? This is something we are going to discuss in one of our coming programs. And meanwhile, now we end this edition of Burning Point, brought to you by me, Ekaterina Kudashkina. Thank you so much for staying with us. Goodbye, and take care.